A country that completely displays civil rights in the United States is our ideal vision of the American dream. A country where each person can choose to live their life exactly how they want to and where we treat everyone with the same equality, fair treatment, and economic rights. Although there are still minorities who feel they have a ways to go on the pursuit for civil equality, the United States as a whole has made huge progress on the road to diminishing discrimination and segregation, which once ruled the way our country thought. In the 1960s, African Americans especially were exposed to mistreatment by white citizens, the government, and even cops, which resulted in the creation of dozens of organizations to help other struggling African Americans. Protests and even violent riots often took place with no surprise. African Americans throughout the years tried all different kinds of protesting methods through their attempted movements due to frustration and not having experience in knowing which way would lead to positive feedback. The Civil Rights March on Washington in 1963, the 1967 Detroit riot, and the Freedom Summer of 1964 in Mississippi were three major protest movements that all went about their mission completely different ways, and that all got some form of success in return. However, history proves managed nonviolent protests result in the most drastic positive results. The March on Washington was one of the largest protest movements advocating civil rights in our country's history. This march went hand in hand with Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, as it was organized by groups of civil rights, labor, and religious organizations to support MLK after his speech of his vision of America where color is only secondary. The march consisted of about 300,000 people, which is huge and nearly impossible to keep under control. However, the march was completely planned to stay nonviolent and include sit-ins and lobbying throughout the town. The major impression the march made on everyone witnessing pushed President John F. Kennedy to promote for civil rights in the legislation, which was a huge deal because protesting alone is not enough to change a government's ideals. Furthermore, the march's success resulted in the Civil Rights Act of 1965 and progress into the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Also, every 5 years there is an anniversary march in honor of that day. The only negative that cannot even be considered as a failure in this situation is that critics were formed by Malcolm X, black nationalist, and his supporters who disagreed with allowing white people to be included in the preparations for the march and the actual walking protest. Him and his followers viewed integration as an illusionary solution to the problems of black Americans. Malcolm X advocated self-reliance, black pride, and unity. Malcolm's message became popular among Northern blacks as the civil rights movement failed to alleviate problems such as poverty, joblessness, police brutality, and de facto segregation, and he voiced his frustration through hateful or violent acts. In 1967, up north in Detroit, Michigan, is where the violent public Detroit riots took place. This 5-day disorderly disturbance started with the police raiding an unlicensed bar in the middle of the night to find a party of African men celebrating the return of their friends from war. The police decided to bring them all to jail, and as they were attempting to do so, a group of other African Americans formed a group in the street and all hell broke loose. The party of black men and the onlookers all started throwing rocks at the police, and once all the police escaped, huge mobs of African Americans went on the loose, causing violence in the streets and looting throughout the town. It got so out of hand, news reporters first avoided airing anything to the public in fear that mobs and riots would spread. However, the riot ended up spreading to other parts of the city regardless. Eventually, Governor George W. Romney ordered the National Guard to come in and help, and President Lyndon B. Johnson also sent Army troops. The troops ended up bringing the riot under control within 48 hours, with a result of 43 people dead and over 400 injured. This riot started out of anger towards the white policemen, but ended with an abundance of violence out of frustration of the horrible living situations they had in Detroit, also known as the Black Ghettos, where segregation and poverty converge on the young to destroy opportunity and enforce failure. Governor Romney quickly urged housing proposals to be passed with resistance from white homeowners in that area. In 1968, Michigan Fair Housing Act was passed, which is a success for the African American community. but Governor Romney also provided his reasoning for wanting the act passed was to avert disorder in his cities, which also could make this act being passed seen as a failure because he isn't exactly advocating civil rights. It seemed to be more out of fear. In 1964, another hands-on protest movement occurred, but in a very opposite way. The Freedom Summer movement was a campaign made up of volunteers, college students who were black, white, north, or south, and civil rights organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Council of Federated Organizations, who attempted to register as many African American voters as possible, aimed to go and engage in the constitution of freedom schools in Mississippi because they historically excluded most blacks from voting. The volunteers and youths involved ended up setting up dozens of freedom schools, freedom houses, community centers, educating other students, and organizing networks to aid the black population. The Mississippi locals were hostile, even violent at times, and they did everything they could to declare these actions illegal. The Freedom Summer movement was not successful in getting many African Americans registered to vote. However, the Freedom Summer successes involved the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that was made up of African Americans that went against the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party, and up to 30 to 40 volunteer summer schools were built. In result, there was a major impact on the civil rights movement, and it captured the nation's attention to the dangers and prosecution African Americans in the South were facing. As I stated prior, the March on Washington, the Detroit Riot, and the Freedom Summer Mississippi movements all had a colossal impact on today's society. Whether the protest was extremely disorganized or extremely violent, the minority is not to blame because they had no past experiences, helping them know what actions will help the most effectively banish racism. However, I do believe managed, thought-out, nonviolent protest movements are the most successful with making a change in the past, and Martin Luther King was a master of pulling them off. Martin Luther King said in his letter from the Birmingham prison, "In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action." And he also defined an injustice as a code inflicted upon a minority which that the minority had no part in enacting or creating because it did not have the unhampered right to vote, which above all is fair to any race, and it gives people an idea how much prior thought he put into his speeches and protests before acting on them because he did not want to cause unnecessary problems. MLK was extremely passionate about putting an end to racism and segregation, but he never once was violent or hateful towards another race because of the way another race treated him. He had a true understanding that discrimination is harming each race and not just his own, and that is why it needs to end. He realized showing violence in a situation involving such a sensitive subject will just give the minority a bigger disadvantage, and in result of his respectful manner, he gained respect from several political leaders who were wanting to help him accomplish his goals. His courageous sacrifices and distinct vision of our country is why he will forever be honored and have his own day celebrated. After his assassination, other protest leaders and civil rights activists began to look up to him. Cesar Chavez even dedicated a speech on the lessons of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s protesting methods, praising what they had done for this country. Racial discrimination and inequality has negatively shaped our history, and we need the right steps to making the United States become the American dream by following MLK's nonviolent protests for the better of our future.